All right, well, I think we're ready to kick things off. Can everyone hear me? Got some thumbs up among our panelists, at least. Well, thank you all for joining and for your interest broadly in carbon neutrality at the University of Michigan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Adam Fisher. I'm U of M's Sustainability Communications Manager. This panel, it's been rescheduled. It was originally part of EarthFest, which celebrates sustainability initiatives across U of M and the surrounding communities. Whether or not you participated in EarthFest activities, I do want to point out that you can view many of the talks, demos, and Skillshare videos from last month's series of events on U of M's EarthFest 2020 YouTube playlist. You can scan the QR code that you see on the slide there for more information. And highlights that you might find of interest include On the Cusp of Change. That's a lecture by Guy O. Williams, an environmental justice advocate. There are also opportunities to learn about and interact with student groups, departments, and community sustainability organizations through meet and greets, through videos and Skillshare workshops. There's a great demo with M Dining chef Tony Piccinatti, who demonstrated how to prepare healthy, sustainable recipes. To pivot a bit, so a brief background on the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality and overall sustainability at U of M. As many, if not all of you know, there's a long storied history of sustainability at the university. The original Earth Day was celebrated here at Chrysler Center on March 12th, 1970. 2 decades later, UM pioneered environmental justice as a field of study. That's more than 30 years ago now. And the first carbon accounting work that helped set the stage for this commission's work was a master's thesis out of the School of Natural Resources and the Environment, now the School of Environment and Sustainability, or SEAS, and that was 20 years ago. The University of Michigan also set a goal in 2011 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2025 and is tracking to meet that goal ahead of schedule. With all of that said, with all of that history said, as proud of it as we are, history is not enough. And sustainability has to be a recurring mission and a recurring project. And with a looming carbon crisis upon us, the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality was launched in February 2019 to bring together students, staff, and faculty across Ann Arbor, Dearborn, and Flint, and Michigan Medicine to chart recommendations to achieve net zero carbon emissions, and to do so in a way that is bold, transferable, scalable, and environmentally just. Crucial to this commission's work, and really the subject of the panel today, has been student efforts on several analysis teams and subgroups: food, biosequestration, buildings, commuting, energy consumption policies, university travel, campus culture, external partnerships, mobility electrification, and carbon accounting. Earlier this month, the commission published analysis team reports from these teams, and those are online. The recommendations made in these reports will inform the commission's final recommendations to the president. And you can check out these reports either at the QR code on the current slide or at sustainability.umich.edu/carbon neutrality, and you can navigate to the analysis teams page from there. We invite you to weigh in through the commission's public comment portal, both on the PCCN's forthcoming draft recommendations, which are expected before the end of this year, and for the purposes of this panel, on the internal analysis team reports. And in particular, we'd like to hear from the students. How would the carbon neutrality strategies proposed in these analysis team reports affect and be received by you? We welcome you to pay attention particularly to the environmental justice section portions of the analysis reports. Point being, with all of these people here representing different analysis teams, this is a broad cross-university push. Excuse me. It's also a nexus of expertise and ideas. And I won't delay. With us today our panelists, co-chair Professor Jennifer Haverkamp, who's the co-chair of the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, and she is also the director of the Graham Sustainability Institute. She's also a professor of practice at the law school. She is joined by Matt Carroll of the Building Standards team, Meg Sherwinski of the Campus Culture and Communication team, Natalie Lambrecht of the Food team, and James Woldridge of the Commuting team. I'll turn it over to our panelists in just a moment, but would like to emphasize here that we have taken and will be taking questions during the event. To submit a question, you can just open the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type your question. And without further delay, I will sit back and turn it over to Professor Haberkamp. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone. Thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, great, wonderful. So really glad that people are taking the time to join us and learn more about what the university is doing on carbon neutrality, and especially what these student analysis teams have been doing and what the experience has been like for the students. When we designed this, and our purpose, as Adam said, is primarily to showcase that experience and their work. And so we are also assuming that a fair number of the members of this audience are not already deeply familiar with the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, or maybe even generally some aspects of addressing climate change. So bear with us if this feels like something you already know, but we want to be inclusive and make sure everyone who's here learns what they wanted to come and learn from it. So I think what I'll start with just very briefly is, what do we mean by carbon neutrality? And you can look on the slide here. The general definition that the UN uses is that carbon neutrality, and the same term or the equivalent term is having a net zero carbon footprint, refers to achieving net zero emissions by balancing a measured amount of carbon released with an equivalent amount that you have offset or that you have taken out of the atmosphere, sequestered. And I should also say that it's not always just carbon dioxide emissions, it's also other sorts of gases, like the elements of achieving neutrality there on the slide. Reductions can include other potent greenhouse gases like coolants that you have in your air conditioners. Methane is a hugely important one, nitrogen, a lot of different gases. Other ways of achieving neutrality, the sequestering aspect. Emission sinks include land use like reforestation. The ocean actually absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide, so that's a sink. And then an area of increasing importance for getting to where we need to be globally is to develop carbon removal technologies. We have so much greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere that we can't just stop emitting and get to where we need to be. We need to be figuring out how to take it out. And so there's a lot of research being done on, can you sequester it underground? How can you capture it and convert it into stable products like cement? We have a whole initiative here at the university called the Global CO2 Initiative that is working on how to try to take some of these technological developments and get them over the valley of death to commercial adoption. So let's see, a couple other things as background. I mentioned what carbon neutrality is, what greenhouse gases are, pretty basic for some of you. But then maybe we should talk about then what types of emissions that we're working with here. The terminology that we generally use to describe the different types of greenhouse gas emissions, refer to them as scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And for the University of Michigan, Scope 1 refers to the greenhouse gases that we ourselves emit, that we are responsible for directly emitting. And so for the university, that is the natural gas burned at the central power plant and at the boilers around our various campuses. It includes the emissions from our vehicles, the university vehicles, the university's fleet, the blue buses that you take. Scope 2 emissions are those emissions that are from purchased electricity. And across all three campuses at the university, those are primarily purchased from our two utilities, DTE and consumers. Scope 3 is kind of everything else. And that is emissions that we are not directly responsible for, but are attributable to us. And for instance, that includes things like the emissions when people commute to and from the university, or the emissions that go into the production of the food you eat and that come from the food that you don't eat as waste. So there's a broad range of these. These are both the hardest for the university to measure, and in a number of cases also much more difficult for us to affect and reduce because they are not directly purchased or directly emitted by us. And as you'll hear, a lot of the work of these analysis teams is focused on some of those scope 3 emissions. What are the ways that we can have an impact on those? Do we know what the emissions are? And how do we also bring those down? The effort, as Adam said, is really large. The University of Michigan community is about 100,000 people strong. So our carbon neutrality efforts need to account for all the different sorts of emitters. He mentioned that our responsibility of this commission is not just the Ann Arbor campus, it's the Dearborn campus, it's the Flint campus. Michigan Medicine is within our charge. A number of schools who have hospital systems don't count that in their climate plans or their targets for when they get to neutrality. And I see why, because Michigan Medicine is about half of our emissions, but it's also, we want to be bold, we want to be leaders, we want to come up with ways to reduce our emissions across the board. And that very much includes the medical system, the research labs. A couple other things that make this challenging is that we are, compared to some of our peer institutions around the country, in a northern, rather cold climate. So we have to really deal with the heating and the cooling around the year. We also, as you all know, are a very large university. We have one of the largest campuses and one of the largest amount of buildings under roof in the United States, North America. I don't know about the world, but it's a very large group and a very large challenge that we have taken on. So let me say a little bit about the process so that we can get on to our students. As Adam mentioned, the commission was created in February of 2019. Here on this slide is the mission that we were charged with: to contribute to a more sustainable and just world by creating approaches and solutions regarding Michigan's carbon emissions that are environmentally sustainable, involve the regional community, and create scalable and transferable models. And I really want to emphasize especially the scalable and transferable there, because as President Schlissel has said, even if we go ourselves to zero, unless we come up with solutions that can be taken up by others that we do in partnership with the region, we're just a small part of the solution. And we believe that the solutions we come up with, the incredible research that this university does, mean that we can punch above our weight and really help to drive down emissions globally. The way that we organized our work, the commission itself is 17 people across faculty, students, staff, external members from the community, from the utilities, but we also, seeing the complexity of this issue, pretty quickly set up these internal analysis teams. And each of those listed on this chart in the center blue box below was led by a faculty expert and convened with student researchers from all three campuses, mostly Ann Arbor, but representatives of all three campuses. And they were charged with going out for their subject areas and bringing back recommendations to the commission of how they thought greenhouse gases could be reduced in their area. Some of them had a somewhat broader, not just emissions reduction scope, like you're going to hear from representative of the campus culture and communication team. We also had a whole team on external collaboration on how the university should be reaching out once we come forward with our recommendations. We sent the analysis teams off to do their work and to bring back their recommendations to us, which they did at the beginning of the summer, and they're now out publicly, as you heard. We as a commission are considering all those inputs, other research and analysis that we ourselves have done or commissioned with external consultants, and are developing our recommendations. The three phases are on this next slide. We are in phase 3. We are in the home stretch. This is the point where we're developing our recommendations. And as Adam mentioned, Before these are sent to the president and the regents, we're looking for public input on our draft report. So our draft report will come out probably in early December. People will have comments and we'll be aiming to get it back to the president in February. The other thing I would say at this point before moving on to the others is I think basically that it's been a great challenge, and it's been great and a challenge to be working on this because the climate change problem facing the globe is really an existential threat, and the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the UN, says that for the world to avoid the dangerous effects of climate change, we all have to go to carbon neutrality by 2050. And a trajectory to get there would call for us to be 45% below our 2010 levels of emissions by 2030, which is in 10 years. And we want and need to be part of that solution. All right, I think if there's anything else that I should add before I go in. I think what I'd like to do now is turn to our student panelists. I have several questions that I'll be asking you, and then we'll turn to audience questions. But I think before we get to the questions, I would like each of you, and I'll call on you, to introduce yourself, say what team you worked on, tell us what you're studying here, and what drew you to get involved in the work of this commission. And I think I'll start with Meg.
All right, hey y'all. I'm Meg Sherwinski. I was on the campus culture and communication internal analysis team. And I am actually a very recent alum, but I studied art and design and nursing in undergrad, and then just finished up my PhD in nursing. And I was interested in the work, I mean, especially the culture and communication work, because as a nurse, I've seen how far-reaching the effects of climate change and like insane carbon emissions can have on health and communities, and recognize that this is not just a technical problem, but it's something that has to sort of pervade our entire culture and everything that we do, which did get reflected in our recommendations. So thanks, looking forward to getting more.
Thank you so much. Natalie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Lambrecht. I was on the food internal analysis team, and I'm a PhD candidate in nutritional sciences at the School of Public Health. And my research broadly looks at agricultural food systems and linkages to global nutrition. And for me, I was really drawn to the PCCN work because I study food systems and think about sustainable food systems at a very global scale and from a research level. And I was excited about the opportunity to work on it at an institutional level where the changes or the recommendations could really be readily implemented, hopefully, and make an impact at a much sooner level.
Great. Mac.
Hi, I'm Mac. I'm a Master of Architecture student in Taubman College. I am part of the Building Standards team. And I think I was originally interested in architecture. That's kind of unrelated, but also related in terms of how ubiquitous buildings are. They are everywhere on university. They are the university campus. And naturally, the commission and carbon neutrality has to be a part of that. So I think just the scale of the university is in the buildings on that drew me to it.
That's an excellent point. I mentioned the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Basically, emissions from our buildings and the use of our buildings are well over 90%, maybe closer to 98%, right, of our greenhouse gas emissions. So huge. James. You're on mute, James.
Oh, I unmute myself. Okay, I thought you were unmuting us. Hi, everyone. My name is James. I was on the commuting team, and I am also a recent graduate. I was studying sustainability at SEAS in urban and regional planning at Tubman. I graduated in the spring. So I was drawn to working on the commission for the same reasons that I was drawn actually to urban planning. I saw how land use and transportation were linked to our emissions and how those impact the planet. And I really saw this as an excellent way to grow my experience, my knowledge, and also give back to the university.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all four. And they are the tip of the iceberg. I think we had something like 100 people across all the different internal and external teams working to develop the recommendations before the commission today. So I'm going to pose a question and invite you to volunteer and answer. If nobody speaks up right away, I'll call on you, but otherwise, whoever wants to go first and then the others can chime in. I think where we'll start is kind of broadly, help us understand in your subject area for your analysis team, why is it relevant to carbon neutrality? What is we talked a little bit about buildings, but in the other areas, what is the significance of the contribution of your subject area to carbon neutrality, both broadly and at the University of Michigan? Oh, maybe I'll call on somebody. How about you, Natalie?
I almost considered volunteering.
Okay.
So again, I was on the food team, and I think our food system is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, it contributes about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to impacting a number of other environmental change parameters like biodiversity loss, land and freshwater use, nitrogen and fertilizer runoff, pollution. So the food system has a huge impact on our environment, and naturally the way that we eat and what we choose to eat is a piece of that, because food isn't necessarily equal in its impact on the climate. And so the same can be said for the University of Michigan, that our food system at the University of Michigan, we have to feed all the students that go to the dining halls. The medical campus feeds their patients and visitors. People buy food on campus. And so the food that we choose to procure, as well as kind of the contracts we have and how we deal with food waste, are all a piece of this puzzle. And it has a large impact on our push towards carbon neutrality.
And do you see differences in how food affects the climate in, say, differences between developed countries and developing countries, or cities versus rural areas? Are there distinctions there that, big picture, that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that is still being determined and needs more research. But in terms of globally, the United States and other large economies are the outsized impact on the food footprint. And a lot of it, which we can talk about later, is from ruminant meat like beef. Beef has an outsized impact compared to other meats and plant-based foods. And in the United States, we eat a lot of meat and a lot of beef. And as countries develop, they also shift towards that type of diet. And so that has broad implications on climate change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I remember too, when I was working on reducing emissions from refrigerants, HFCs at the State Department, also the fact is countries become more economically developed and people eat more processed foods. There's more need for refrigeration. There's more transport of refrigerated food. It just vastly increases the dependence on those gases. Mm-hmm. Somebody else, how would you answer that question?
I'll go. So,
Thanks.
according to the EPA, transportation accounts for 28% of all emissions in 2018. So the University of Michigan didn't know how much of its transportation emissions accounted for it. So our team was pretty much tasked with figuring out the amount of scope 3 emissions and also then recommending strategies. And so what we ended up finding was scope 3 emissions were equivalent to 49% of the scope 1 emissions, or 21% of the scope 1 and 2 emissions. So by no means a small share. And so off of that, we ended up recommending strategies to help reduce those.
Great. Mac?
Yeah, I would just reiterate what's already been said. I mean, the buildings use a lot of energy. On a global scale, they use about 40% of all energy, which to an extent is the program that's happening within it. But then it's also about just us living in them. We need heat and cooling when we're not in a climate that we can tolerate normally. We need ventilation to be able to breathe so CO2 doesn't build up. It's just a fact that shelter in a developed country requires.
Especially in the colder climates, or the hot ones too, frankly. People in the Middle East are needing a lot more air conditioning as the climate warms. Megan, how would you say your subject is relevant to carbon neutrality?
All right, so ours being culture and communication is sort of encompassing of all of the other ones, in that we were tasked with looking at individual behavior, but also moving into collective action and how we communicate things. So if we're thinking about sort of like technological ways to address the problem with system change and innovation, that will help. But there is a significant portion that has to be addressed by individual behavior. And so I suppose our charge was figuring out how to borrow your sort of metaphor from before, over the valley of death from the early adopters of pro-environmental behaviors and carbon saving measures into making it sort of the ubiquitous cultural norm and visible in everything that we do. And that can come in a lot of different ways. We spent a lot of time eliciting ideas from the community, because there are these structural things that will help us decrease our carbon emissions, but there are also ways that individuals can sort of figure out our own solutions and create solutions that are particular to specific contexts. So it's rather abstract, but I mean, culture and communication are huge. So it's really helping us make sure that we that sort of at the beginning, we talked about the scale of impact, that this isn't just the University of Michigan, but that we're each doing things alone, but but that we're crossing over into bigger impact.
Very true. I won't get this exactly right, but I've heard people say you can have a LEED platinum building, but if people open the windows on a below zero day, or they don't turn the lights out, you can't maintain the carbon footprint of that building without the behavioral changes that are needed, right? So
Definitely going to talk more about that.
Good.
Don't forget about how you get to the building too.
Well, I guess you walk, right? Or bike? No. Exactly. Okay. Well, let's see. How about going a little bit to the actual work of your groups? in your subject areas, what are some of the barriers that you identified? What are some of the unexpected barriers, whether it's technical, institutional, culture, we talked a little bit about economic. What would stand between achieving progress in your area and today?
I can start off.
Thanks, James.
So all of our kind of recommendations address these. So one of our recommendations was for the University of Michigan to invest in faculty and staff housing, which it currently does not provide, and more student housing. This is simply just because Ann Arbor's housing market does not allow faculty and staff to live close enough to where they can take lower carbon intense modes of transit, whether this be walking, cycling, scootering, or public transportation. Another thing was to change up the parking. There's a lot of, anxiety that people have around changing parking rules, changing parking fees, even if those parking fees become more equitable. And then partnerships with Ann Arbor and Flint and Dearborn. All these were kind of across all the campuses to, increase the amount of cycling infrastructure, to increase public transit, and all those kinds of efforts. So there are, I guess I would group that into 3 big buckets, but those were kind of what we found and what we came up with.
Mm-hmm. How would you answer that one, Matt?
Yeah, I would say one of the kind of struggles was that there's a lot of technology out there for achieving net zero energy buildings, but then that relational to scope 1 and scope 2, but then scope 3 is kind of like, it's kind of on the back burner right now, and like building materials and embodied energy within building materials, and is still a large part that still needs to be addressed at some point. And then one of the things that was kind of out of the approach was occupant behavior, and like you were talking about, like opening up windows, and how that's really on the occupant.
Can you say for people who aren't familiar with it, a little more what you mean by embodied carbon?
Sure. So there's the process in producing any type of object, and that produces carbon in itself. So a pen has plastic, but then the plastic had to be made from petroleum. So then that whole process in itself, by the time the pen gets to the building, it has a carbon footprint already. And then when we're talking about scope 1 and 2 in buildings, and what we were kind of tasked with is addressing space and heating and cooling in the buildings, but then there's a whole nother aspect to like what makes up the walls and what makes up the windows, which is still significant.
Yeah, just because you buy and drive a Tesla doesn't mean you have a 0 carbon footprint. The production of that vehicle generated lots of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah. Natalie, thoughts on this question? Barriers?
Yeah, and I guess I have a slightly different angle than the others in more technical challenge for our team, which was getting data. So we kind of focused on 2 bins, food procurement and food waste, and getting food procurement data from this like very complex, our food system at University of Michigan is incredibly complex, and everyone is independent. And so they order differently, but they also track their data differently. And in order to even just estimate like what the percent of emissions from like scope 1 and 2, or what our carbon footprint from food was at the University of Michigan, we had to really dig to try to get data that would be able to answer that question. And in order to make progress and track progress on carbon neutrality, you have to have a baseline. And so I think that was our biggest challenge, is getting food procurement data and then being able to link that to greenhouse gas emissions, which M-Dining has done, the residential dining system that serves the undergraduates. They've been tracking their food procurement data and linking it to greenhouse gas emissions. That's really like was the core of our work. But getting that from other units was challenging, and I think something that the university can work towards. And then the same thing with food waste. It's challenging to get that data in order to like figure out how much food is being wasted. You have to do food audits, and those are timely, they're expensive, and they take a lot of energy to do so. So that's pretty challenging. And I think that also gets to your earlier point about like scalability and transferability to other institutions, is that if we can figure this out and make recommendations towards it, other universities could do the same and have some sort of tracking system.
That's great. And, you know, I think we're big enough and with enough diversity that we'll have examples for different institutions. Like myself, as a relative newcomer to the University of Michigan, it took me a while to realize everybody isn't fed through M-Dining. That's, you know, the Ross has its own contracts and its own dining system, and the law school has its own system. And of course, Dearborn and Flint have different systems. And so even implementing solutions and negotiating those contracts are not one-stop shopping. It's quite complicated.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And I want to also say, just go back to all of you a little bit more on this data question that Natalie brought up, because it's really important to figuring out how to get a handle on and reduce and know that we've reduced our greenhouse gases from these types of emissions. Is you have to be able to measure or estimate as close as possible what kind of emissions are generated from that area. James, can you talk about where we got the information about commuting that you used?
Yeah, so we had to engage in a very confidential process of getting information from HR. So basically, everything was completely, how to describe, anonymous, in terms of we got addresses from the payroll and basically where faculty and staff were living. And then from, I forget which department, was the registrar for where students had their registered addresses. And again, all this was completely anonymous. One of the issues with the student data was that a lot of students would leave their parents' addresses, and so we couldn't quite trust it. We made actually quite a few commuting maps, but we would have like 3,000 people who would be in California. And we know that 3,000 people don't commute every day from California. So the student numbers were a little bit more estimates, but we ended up being much more confident in our numbers for faculty and staff in terms of their emissions. And there's a commuting map in our report that demonstrates just how far away a lot of the faculty and staff live, because there is not affordable housing for them in the area, or frankly, there's not even housing that is unaffordable for them, but that's another story.
And then once you had these maps of where people lived, we know where you live, where was your source of information about what types of transportation people were using? Wasn't that partly from the SCIP surveys?
Yes, so our expert in this was a I think he's a senior now named Griff, and he used Skip survey data and I think a couple other sources because the Skip survey was not perfect to what we needed. And so I know that he and Abbas, who was kind of our statistician expert, worked really hard to create estimates, and they also used some information from the EPA.
Mhm. Great. The SKIP survey, for people who don't know, is something that's done every couple of years. It's a general survey of people's behaviors, attitudes, understandings around sustainability to help the University of Michigan track our progress on a whole range of sustainability goals. And so one of those does look into and have people answer questions around their form of transportation. So that helps, though it's just a survey. Megan, do you want to weigh in on this one before we move on to another topic?
The barriers?
Yeah.
Sure. I think in our context, a big barrier was, it's a barrier and a strength in some senses, which is the decentralization of the university. So in order for individual action to feel effective and meaningful, it's helpful to feel part of something bigger and to have a collective action and vision and purpose. But the University of Michigan, with academic freedom, every unit has different sort of governance. And so what we found is that there are a lot of people doing a lot of really great things and a lot of people with good ideas, but we're not necessarily communicating well with each other. And I think that's reflected in our recommendations to sort of create a general office that is at the level of vice provost, vice president, to make sure that everybody is communicating and that we're not reinventing the wheel or spending time where others have already done a lot of good work. So yeah, I think the decentralized nature, and then as well, sort of engaging people on a topic so large, and that can feel really, really daunting. So.
I think this leads to, I think, what people would love to hear more about, which is, as part of your work, what insights did you all get into sustainability here at the University of Michigan? As you looked at the recommendations that you were trying to develop, where did you feel like there were impressive things already happening, and where in particular are there some real areas where we need improvement? And if that, Megan, if that makes sense for you to build on what you just said, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, sort of an example of good and good work being done, but improvements in our sort of collective action is there are a lot of people really passionate, like in different units, about taking actions to decrease use of disposables in their kitchens, and sort of as a group in the workplace, improve commuting practices and food practices. And these are, I went to a session that Kelly Jones helped to, with the Planet Blue Ambassadors, helped to organize with green teams. And so, the leaders here are so passionate, so engaged, that most of them are not getting credit to do this work. They just care that much about it, which leads to another issue that I think room for improvement is that there wasn't an incredible amount of resources in some units, and the work wasn't uniformly valued. So there were some people, like, I don't remember exactly which units, that were recognized for the work, but others, like I said, they are going above and beyond what their normal work is, and that unfortunately is not super sustainable.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
plays into what people often say about the University of Michigan, which is one of our greatest strengths and one of the biggest challenges to change is how decentralized we are and how much
Mhm.
autonomy the different units have.
Yeah. I will say as well, we looked towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, that giant university level
Mhm.
effort as a model for how this sort of carbon neutrality infrastructure that would reach every citizen on campus could be designed. And we learned a lot from them as well. And also learned ways that the two would go in tandem, right? Because they absolutely need to, as we were discussing the importance of environmental justice. This is not a technical problem. It has impacts on real humans.
Mhm.
So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Who else on this one? What are you impressed with? Where can we do better? I know there are lots of ways we can do better.
I can build on what Meg was saying because I agree with all of her points. And I think we experienced similar things in that there's a lot of effort around food sustainability on campus already. There's a lot of really passionate students. There's a lot of incredible faculty researchers doing work on this subject. We have the student farm, we have Maize and Blue Cupboard, and Dining has Sustainable Mondays. So there's a lot going on already, but it is this challenge of how decentralized it is. And there's all these student projects that happen, but like tracking them and implementing them and kind of channeling the amount of student energy we have around working on the food system and sustainability, I think is a challenge. And part of it came down when we did some interviews with faculty and staff is providing institutional support for faculty and staff to support students and to actually get paid and allocated time to supporting all these student projects. And then creating some sort of institutionalized way for that to like contribute to our efforts. Yeah.
Great, thank you. James?
So I'm trying to think. Obviously, I already kind of said what I think the university could do better, what we thought the university could do better on housing, parking, and public transit. One of the things that we were surprised by was the University of Michigan's rideshare program. I think the program on the Ann Arbor campus had a ridiculous amount of growth within the last 8 years. I'm not going to throw out a number because I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I remember Griff coming back and like being puzzled and doing a week of double checking the numbers because it was a pretty substantial amount of growth in the number of people who are ride sharing. So that was a really great offer to see. And then, yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of experience with telecommuting. Huh?
I was going to say, and that continued even after gasoline prices started coming back down again in the last several years. Just trying to.
No, it's. I think I'm trying to remember like really minute details. And I think the program was started. It was started within the last 10 years, and it has increased ever since, the number of people who are participating in the rideshare program, the rideshare carpooling program. So yeah, we thought that was pretty impressive.
That is impressive. We need to figure out why so we can do more of it. So
yeah.
I interrupted you. You were going to make another point.
No, that was about it. I think we did a lot of community outreach, and one of the things about the rideshare program is it's just not well known about. So increasing its awareness and increasing the incentives to participate in it will help with that.
I'd say across most of these areas, there's an educational component that'll be critical to implementing the recommendations.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's definitely a educational component, also a participation voting component about this as well.
Say more. What do you mean by a voting component?
So how to say this? There's kind of individual actions that we can take. And so for what I guess my team would recommend is try to take lower forms of carbon transportation, you know, walking, cycling, public transit, instead of driving your own automobile by yourself to school or to work. But then there is the collective action of voting for basically, you know, more sustainable public transit, more sustainable housing options. We vote on the regents, we vote on all these kinds of things that can really affect the way that Michigan interacts with Ann Arbor and the kind of environment that it creates. So it's one thing to have sustainable buildings like we were talking about earlier. It's another thing to put those in an area where people can have the option to walk, to bike, to take public transit. And right now, a lot of people just don't have that option. So even if they wanted to, they couldn't do it, or they couldn't do it safely.
Exactly. Mac.
I guess kind of going off that, through our work, we found that like there are a lot of really passionate people in like the AEC department, which is the Architecture, Engineering, and Construction department, which kind of oversees all the buildings on campus. There are a lot of really passionate people in that department about sustainability, and to like integrate that better with like the existing Ann Arbor community to try and address like the housing crisis within Ann Arbor is like, there's a potential for a super fruitful interaction between the existing community and the community that is our school, that I would like to see more of, that our team would like to see more of, I think. We, through our research, residential buildings show some of the best potential to reduce carbon emissions relative to the building typologies, I think. But like a hospital is obviously more difficult, but we can make the biggest action very quickly within housing, and housing is a big issue on the table right now, especially relative to Proposition C in Ann Arbor, which is on the ballot coming up, just to put that in. And then, really, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say the housing question is really intertwined with a lot of the others, because so many students move off campus after their first year. So an awful lot of the student housing and the greenhouse gas emissions from our students living in the community are outside of the university and, you know, in the landlord's control, and the incentives there are quite difficult to deal with. But that's very much a big piece of the footprint. On the other hand, if you get all that housing fixed up and families can move in, and then students have to live farther and farther out unless we build more close-in housing, then we have more commuting problems. So they're very intertwined. Here's a question. You guys are representing different teams, but you're all here together on the same panel. Your topics are distinct, but they're interconnected. How did you see while you were working on it, or how do you see now, looking around, how the work of your particular team interconnects with the other teams? How do they complement it? Because I ask this in part because sitting on the commission, we've now been given all your reports, and we're in the position of having to look for the interconnections and figure out which things should move together, or how one particular recommendation is a little inconsistent with a recommendation from another group. So would really love your thoughts on that.
Happy to jump in here. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just, go ahead.
Here, Natalie.
Okay, so I think ours really intertwined with the campus culture team, because food is such a cultural aspect of our lives, and changing the food behavior at the University of Michigan will be a culture shift for the university. And so we really drew on communication with the culture team and talking to them to understand what sort of actions they were recommending that we could bridge into. So for example, as Meg mentioned, this like the DEI system of having unit level kind of from the top, and then unit level, I guess, groups that guide each unit's plan for carbon neutrality. We thought, putting food as a central pillar of those units would be really important, and finding ways to incentivize students to adopt more carbon friendly food behaviors. One thing that they suggested, and that we also suggested, was this thing called program impact points, which I think was supposed to be piloted. I'm not sure if it is given COVID, but basically
It's been postponed, but still very much in the works.
Yeah. So, and it's such a great program. It's for, first year students to incentivize them to adopt behaviors like composting or getting a meal at the vegetarian line. So I think that's really where we intertwined, is like how do we create a campus culture that is about food sustainability and get everybody on board, rather than having it be like an individual thing. You have your vegans and your non-vegans. That's not what we want. We want, a whole campus culture that's about plant forward eating and composting and less waste.
And how to have it be embraced, right? Or
Exactly.
done in a way that doesn't strike people as contrary to their strong preferences, because people have very strong views about food. And it's not just the French and their cheese, right? But thinking about the Meatless Mondays, and didn't you guys uncover some indication that on Meatless Mondays the restaurants around town got a whole lot more business?
Yeah, it's funny when you tell people that you're taking away meat, they don't like that very much. So M Dining had Meatless Mondays, and then they switched it to Sustainable Mondays, because the wording around interventions is really important. One of the things that we recommended in our report is to make changes that are inconspicuous. So people are in this environment where it's very easy to make plant forward choices. And by plant forward, I mean, making vegetables and fruits and legumes the focus of what you're eating. It doesn't mean not eating any meat. It doesn't mean not eating any dairy. It just means reducing the amount that you're eating. Mm-hmm. And so if you, at an institutional level, make those changes so that people don't even realize that they're perhaps eating less meat, that's going to go a lot farther than like a Meatless Monday campaign, where people are know that you're taking away meat. And then, I think a couple dining halls instituted it, and then all the students went to the dining halls that weren't doing Meatless Mondays. So you have to be aware of kind of the effects of any intervention.
Mm-hmm. I would guess that commuting is also interrelated to campus culture, looking for the interconnections. No?
Yes. I think it was funny when during our outreach events, we found undergrads to be typically more aware of the public transit in Ann Arbor, more aware of where the bike lanes were, more aware of, they just tended to live closer than the grad students. We actually ran into more grad students who were part of those who commuted with their vehicle. Another thing, because we did recommend, you know, building student housing, I think my work would my team's work would heavily relate to Mark's work. And I think we'd have a very interesting discussion about, probably not one for right now, but about embodied energy and the embodied energy of buildings, but also the embodied energy of infrastructure, because you want to choose the best materials and the best forms of building, but it's also a struggle between, are we building infill or are we building sprawl, and the kind of embodied energy of the infrastructure that comes along with that.
Mhm, mhm. Mac, I think you wanted to weigh in on this one too, right?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to highlight one of the teams that we don't have on the panel right now.
Please.
Just the energy policies, energy consumption policy.
Great.
We worked pretty closely with them actually, in thinking about how expensive capital projects are. Like, they require a lot of capital. So in order to fund that up front, the energy consumption policies team has thought about what's called the revolving energy fund, which is kind of like a fund that pays for itself because energy is, like, sustainable energy is cheap, basically. And what happens is the money from that, the other team was working on this as part of their report. And what would happen is that money would come out of that fund to fund a upgrade of LEDs in a building on campus. And then because LEDs are more energy efficient, the building would use less energy, therefore it would cost less, and that money would go back into the revolving energy fund. So that was directly intertwined. And then campus culture, the overlap is exactly as we were talking about with like opening a window. Like, buildings are designed in such a way that the climate is very narrow, like 68 degrees Fahrenheit to like 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And you're supposed to survive in that. So, like, getting the campus into a culture where we're like more okay with being a little bit outside of our comfort zone can really impact how much energy a building uses.
Great. So we're going to transition in a minute to taking some questions from the audience. Before we do that, I would like each of you to answer this question. We asked each of the teams to give us at least 3 recommendations and strategies. For each of you, among the recommendations that your team came forward with, or one that you liked that was left on the cutting room floor, what do you think was the boldest or would have the most impact? And the most impact can mean the impact here at the university or the impact because it's scalable and transferable. For each of your reports, what do you think is your bold, most impactful recommendation?
I can go ahead, since what I will say sort of relates back to the last question as well, which I'll take a second to just say that, like we mentioned, sort of, some interconnections with campus culture were mentioned, but as we were meeting throughout the process of our internal analysis team research, we realized that some of our recommendations could stand to provide some infrastructure for the continuing work. So the commission will come up with a plan, but instituting that plan is it's going to be a lot of work. There's going to need to be changes made. People are going to need to be talking. And so some of our higher level organization recommendations, we sort of viewed as a way to sort of have, people from the revolving fund, energy revolving fund, hopefully talking to people and building standards in one central way. But that being said, I think our first recommendation is the boldest, and it's a very bold idea. We called it, we wanted to develop the campus into a living learning laboratory for carbon neutrality and sustainability, which sounds really broad, but at its essence is making sure that our efforts are visible enough and touching every single student, staff, faculty, visitor, alumni that engages with our campus, so that the impact is broader. So what that looks like is having an educational requirement across all disciplines, because we're all implicated here. We all need to be thinking about how our work affects carbon neutrality. Having staff training that everybody gets when they walk in the door, as well as continuing ed training for alumni. I will also say that living learning laboratory, we also envisioned as a way for sort of things to be troubleshot, and new ideas to come to the front, because this isn't, we have the resources to do this, but we couldn't possibly make a plan to do everything right now. It's going to be an ongoing effort where everybody's needed. So
Great. I'm going to ask the others of you, in the interest of time, to get to some of the questions that the audience has been asking us, to try to fold your answer to that question of mine into responding to some of the other questions we have, if appropriate. But I'd like, I think, when we talk about the audience questions, we invited the audience to submit questions in advance. And so some of the ones I've gotten are coming from that, and some others are ones that have been posed to us during the course of this discussion. I think the first one I invite folks to respond to is, for recommendations that involve individual behavior change or even sacrifices, meatless Mondays, whatever, how do you recommend motivating our community to achieve the scale of change that we need?
I can speak to that because I think that changing our food habits is incredibly challenging. And I think that reducing meat is, an individual behavior that is very hard to change and to motivate people to do. And so to link into your question, that I think that was our boldest recommendation is moving towards plant-forward diets. And more specifically, reducing beef, because beef has the largest impact of all animal source foods. And I think what we recommended was, over the next 10 years, reducing beef by 75% in the U of M dining system. And what we focused on was not the individual motivation necessarily, but institutional level changes that could be made to help people make those behaviors, or to help people make those changes. They're little behavioral nudges, or what we call choice architecture, which is that the environment in which you're making food decisions supports more plant-forward choices. So a lot of our recommendations, if you look at our individual report, is around what the dining halls and what individual food procurement units could do to make to help people make more plant-forward choices. Part of it is like making vegetable meals sound appealing based on the wording and how you describe those meals. Part of it, for example, is your salad or your whatever you're eating, is meat a default, or do you have to opt in to add meat? Right now, we often opt out of meat, but a lot of the research shows that like these little nudges can actually really make big changes in your behavior.
That's great, very helpful. Like in the naming, I remember Patagonian toothfish became Chilean sea bass, and then people wanted to eat it. So anyway, others on hard choices, sacrifices. How do you motivate them, James?
So I really wanted to piggyback off that because I felt like for our work, it's really different. Because a big part of your commute is institutional. It's what are your actual options. So, she used the word default. Well, the default for a lot of people, transportation-wise, is a single occupancy vehicle, which has, the highest emissions out of all the options for transportation. So really, it's about institutional changes that give people that choice, because a lot of people actually do like walking. They, right now public transit isn't very popular because of COVID, but I remember being on the Michigan buses last year and things were packed. There were times I couldn't get on the buses because of how packed they were. So it really is an institutional option. And yes, there is individual choice, but right now the numbers that we found were that people don't have those transportation choices. And it's because of the environment, the urban or lack of urban environment that they have.
And speaking of people and limited choices, one of the questions from the audience that I invite folks to speak to is on environmental justice. We tasked each of your teams with considering environmental justice and incorporating that into your report. Can you tell us how your team addressed those questions? What are examples of how your recommendations may have been shaped by that, or things that you think the university needs to be thinking about as it works to implement your recommendations?
So I can go real quick on this. There were I can say that there were housing strategies and options that we discovered other universities doing that we decided would not suit the Ann Arbor, Dearborn, or Flint campuses because of their impact on the housing market, because of their impact on lower income individuals. So I'm not going to say what those universities were or what those strategies were, because I don't want to, badmouth any other institutions. But the reality is that they would not suit the campuses. And we also ended up putting in certain partnerships that University of Michigan could have for transportation that would really broaden the access to buses. I think we had a really long discussion about, I am blanking on the road, but basically the effects of a bus rapid transit combination project between the University of Michigan and Ann Arbor, and how if the project were to come together and be a partnership between the two, it could really serve this transit corridor that would be really impactful for a lot of people. So that was kind of our big thing, was about really the affordability of the community.
Others on environmental justice? Certainly came up in some of the other groups that aren't represented here as well. Mac?
Yeah, I think to wrap that back into what's the most important of our recommendations, we suggested prioritizing partnerships, kind of like what James was talking about, between affordable housing and sustainable development. So kind of what I was talking to earlier in the presentation, where housing is such a big, important part in like the stability of people's lives, like having a place to be. And if the university can prioritize that sort of development while working into while prioritizing carbon neutral goals, it's a super important step forward.
Great. Megan.
Sure. I'll reiterate what I mentioned earlier, is that we tried to learn a lot from folks working on DEI and talk about how diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts could be folded in and linked with hopefully the organizational structure for carbon neutrality efforts at the unit level and beyond. But I'll also talk briefly about our last recommendation, which was about decarbonizing the investment portfolios that staff and faculty are able to use their retirement funds for. And so in that instance, that's environmental justice at a larger level, and ensuring that we're coupling what we're doing on campus with sort of our broad, our actions across the board, and ensuring that that, you know, we're not benefiting from emissions elsewhere that will be negatively impacting folks' health.
Natalie.
Yeah, so I think our team intersects with food justice and equity considerations in a couple ways. One is thinking about the Flint and Dearborn campuses, and that a lot of the changes we proposed require institutional support, and that if these suggestions or recommendations that we're making require individual units, individual campuses to secure funding to support them, that we're gonna inequally have these sorts of changes. So like, I think it was the Flint campus that was either Flint or Dearborn, I can't remember now, that didn't have any sort of composting capacity. And there are just these changes that need to be made that really require support for all of U of M's campuses. And then the other two places, briefly, one of our recommendations was around food waste and food diversion, or diverting food waste from the landfill. And that can either go to composting, but it also could go to food recovery. And food insecurity is a huge problem on college campuses. We, of course, have Maize and Blue Cupboard, which is an incredible program for food insecurity for college students. But if we could find ways to divert perfectly good food that would otherwise get thrown away to providing food for students, that would be an incredible opportunity. And then, of course, our food procurement, thinking about supporting local farms, but not just local farms, but also underrepresented farmers and minority farmers who aren't receiving institutional support.
I think racial justice demands that we look very closely at our procurement practices and make sure that we're finding all the providers and not just going to the usual suspects. It's an important piece of it. We got a couple questions that I think are more directed maybe to me, which is around the use of offsets and whether Michigan has a target year for carbon neutrality. And I should have explained this at the beginning, but the charge that the president gave the commission was to come up with a pathway to carbon neutrality, which includes both strategies and a proposed timeline. So a question that the commission is working on is what goal year or years would we recommend for the university for its neutrality? And intertwined with that is another question we got about the use of offsets. A lot of institutions, universities, companies, other institutions that are setting carbon neutrality goals very much count on offsets as part of that strategy. So as we figure out what our goal year will be, we are also considering, should offsets be a part of that? And if so, what would the criteria be that we would consider important for the university to use offsets? There a lot of different views about offsets, and there are a lot of different kinds of offsets. So it's a important and complicated question. But those are both within areas that we're still discussing and hope to make recommendations with respect to. Another question from the audience that I think, Meg, especially your group worked on, but I'd like to hear how others think about it is, as you were saying earlier, how, once these recommendations are delivered to the university, do they get implemented? And are there structural changes that are needed? Obviously, there are behavioral changes that we're looking for people, but on an institutional level, did your group have recommendations for how to see your recommendations implemented by the university and followed through time? Because this is a multi-decade exercise. Do you want to say a little bit, Meg, about the organizational structures?
Okay, sorry, I didn't know if you said I had already talked about that.
You talked about the importance of it, but I don't think you talked about it. You talked about the living lab, which is also a really important piece of it.
Mm-hmm. So our second recommendation was to create an office that would work directly with the president, involving a vice president and a vice provost, the vice president to look at things like, or to sort of handle the good work and be, I guess, the leader of the effort in athletics and the hospital, while the provost would work on educational and curricular work. And so we envisioned, similar to DEI, that then there would be unit level leadership in each of the units on campus, figuring out what worked best, getting information about the larger level capital investments, and sort of adjusting to the specific context. Yeah, I mean, that's the broad thing, is that we really were hoping that that resources would be invested in creating this high level office akin to DEI that would lead this effort and allow for like the feeding up of ideas, but the sort of top down provision of resources, investments, support, best practices, etc. Information sharing, all of that. And as well to handle some of what our colleagues at the external collaboration team, like making sure that we're touch pointing with regional partners, NGOs, folks working on environmental justice in the area, to keep all of that work current, so that we're not sort of extracting information and then leaving, that it's a continuing partnership and that they know who to go to at the U.
We just have 2 or 3 minutes left, so I want to invite others to comment on this question, or if not, I'll ask you my next question.
I just have a point to add, building off of what Meg said, and within this kind of structural, institutional level, like organization, built off of DEI, that there would be some sort of manager who would be in charge of procurement contracts and RFPs. And we noted that there wasn't clear guidance on procurement, not just of food, but of like office supplies. And this might lead into like building as well, or different sectors, where clear language on what guidelines the university wants or expects when making contracts, and actually holding the vendors to account, was a gap that we saw that I think has a lot of potential at the institutional level.
Great. Mac or James? Okay, then I think my last question for any of you before I hand it back to Adam to take us out is, what would be an immediate next step if your recommendations were put in our report and handed to the president and the regions? What are some things that you think could be undertaken relatively quickly? Building housing is going to take a while. What could happen faster?
We're really,
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go. I think you were unmuted like just before.
A really quick one is compost bins. There are not compost bins in every building, in every unit, in every bathroom. And that is such an easy thing that we could do, is just put compost bins in places where people can actually access it.
Thank you. Anybody else? James.
I'll jump in right off that with a comment about compost. C's had compost, but they had it was entirely student run. It was student run and student funded. So yeah, let's get the university to fund that and take care of it on every building. So what could the university do right away? Well, it's already implementing the carpool program that I talked about, and it could do a little bit of a better job advertising that. But yes, housing is not built overnight, but I would say that the process to build the housing and to make sure that it is equitably provided and to make sure that it is designed well and that people find it pleasing, want to live with it. There is also a bit of a need for buildings to be somewhat adaptable for future needs. And those design decisions take some time. The funding takes some time. And so what really could be done right away is the process of that project. And so for those of you who don't know, the North Campus Northwood has repeatedly been redesigned in various different design competitions. I think as far back as I can't remember, but it's mentioned in the Redoing Northwood project plans from back in like 2006. So really those kind of things take a while, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't start them right away.
Okay.
So
Great.
that is my response about housing.
That's good. So speaking of time, we've come to the end of this, and before I hand it over to Adam, I just want to thank all four of you for your participation today, but even more, the great work that you and your colleagues did on each of these IATs. We've just found such high quality and such richness in those recommendations, and encourage those of you on this call who are interested to go to the website, read them. We're not looking for edits to them. We're looking for, how do you see these recommendations impacting you, and which do you think the commission should take forward? Adam.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to our panelists. This was just such a wonderfully interesting panel, and I just love to hear about all of the synergies between your efforts and your research, and I really look forward to seeing how the commission looks at these reports in tandem and hopefully build some intersecting lessons between your different teams from both a technical and adaptive approach. One thing I didn't mention at the beginning is that this panel will be available on the UMich YouTube channel as soon as we can get it available. So for those of you in the audience who would like to refer to certain details or just pass it along to friends or peers or colleagues, that will be available shortly. And again, I just want to reiterate something that I raised at the beginning of the panel, and that's that the commission invites you to weigh in both on the forthcoming draft recommendations, which Jennifer mentioned will be available in December, as well as these internal analysis team reports, which were released earlier this month. So if you have comments on recommendations on the internal analysis team reports on this panel or the broader commission process, we invite you to weigh in at the Carbon Commission webpage. That is sustainability.umich.edu/carbon neutrality. And from there, you can navigate to any of those resources you're most interested in. Thank you again, and hope you have a great rest of your week.